Hello and welcome to the Friday, October the 18th edition of New Voice of Ukraine's question and answer live streams, where we take your questions and we try to answer them on whatever the big news topic is of the week. And this week we have two topics, actually. The first will be on how President Zelensky announced his victory plan to our Western allies in hopes that with broad international support, this plan can be put into place and eventually achieve victory in this war for Ukrainian survival. And the second topic that we'll be talking about is the introduction of North Korean soldiers to the war on Ukraine. I'm Anthony Bardaway here with Editor-in-Chief Romeo Kokriatsky. So hello, everyone. Welcome, Romeo.
Hey, good to be here. So there's not a lot of preamble. Those are the two main stories of the week, the two big ones at least. And I figure it's worth just diving straight into them. We got a number of questions on this topic, but before diving into the questions, let's review what exactly the victory plan consists of. So this is a 5-stage plan with 3 secret annexes, and we'll cover those in a bit. The 5-stage plan, it's not that complicated. The first stage consists of inviting Ukraine to join NATO. That is, Ukraine expects to receive a NATO membership invite. The second point involves strengthening Ukraine's defenses, meaning getting the long-range restrictions lifted, continuing with military operations both in Russia proper and in the occupied territories, and ensuring that Russia is unable to freeze the conflict in any of these areas and create quote-unquote buffer zones. Next up, Ukraine claims that it wants to create what Zelensky deems a non-nuclear strategic deterrent package. What exactly that consists of is pretty vague, but I think some of his comments later on that we'll go into will clarify exactly what that means. The fourth point is more U.S. and EU involvement in the Ukrainian economy, more partnerships, bilateral treaties, direct investment, and so on, to ensure that Ukraine's economy is strengthened ahead of any possible negotiations with Russia. And finally, Ukraine is offering to replace some of the U.S. military deployments in Europe. There's a bunch of long-term U.S. bases in Europe, some NATO-related, some left over from the Second World War. And for some of these bases, Ukraine is offering to replace the U.S. troops with their own soldiers. And again, we'll talk about why exactly Zelensky put that into the plan a little later. And like I said, there are 3 secret annexes, addendums, points that were not publicly revealed. It's difficult to say what these points are given that they're classified, but an educated guess can be made that these likely refer to exact numbers for military arms requests, maybe some secret and classified military details that Ukraine doesn't want out in public, but has shared with the top leadership of partner nations, though granted not all of them. And so all of that together is Zelensky's victory plan. So we get into NATO, we win on the battlefield, we create a deterrence package, our economy gets real strong, and we start shouldering the burden of defending Europe instead of the U.S. military. And so with that said, I'm sure listeners probably have a lot of questions, because when I read these points, I had a lot of questions, and hopefully we can elucidate a bit more on some of these. So with that said, let's go into the questions now and talk about the first one, which is a listener was asking, what's the point of this victory plan? We've been 3 years into the war. There is no cloud at the light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't seem like either Ukraine or Russia is moving any closer to any kind of peaceful resolution. The Russians are obviously still committing daily war crimes and atrocities against both the military and the civilian population. So what is the point of presenting this now?
Yeah, I can give a first go at this. This is largely this is a demand that especially the Americans have been making, is they keep on saying, we want to see a plan. How does Ukraine foresee victory? And like, none of these points are new, really. They're all just the various demands or requests that the Ukrainian government has been making, like been wanting NATO, have been wanting more support, have been spelling out its battlefield strategy and even cooperating on it at times. But yeah, this is a political demand, and it's especially coming up right before the U.S. elections. So if we look at some of the funding pauses, instigated especially by the Republican Party, there are the consistent demand of what are the Ukrainians even doing? Do they have a goal for how this war ends? How long do we need to fund this war? And honestly, I think it's kind of a silly question, because you fight the war as it's being fought. We can't really foresee how it will go. When America was entering World War II, we did not say, oh, we can only be here for a couple of months unless we know that Hitler will fall tomorrow. It's a ongoing and evolving process, but this has been a political demand that was made. And so this victory plan I see as basically PR. It's a way of saying that, yes, our various requests all have a central idea of winning the war. And if we follow this plan, we will win it. That's what you've been asking us to say. So now we're saying it. So are you happy?
Yeah, I largely agree with that. The diplomatic pressure on Ukraine has increased, especially in the last 4 months, in terms of partner nations pushing Ukraine to work towards some kind of at least plan to have some kind of peaceful end to the war. We see a lot of political forces in partner nations that are outright saying that Ukraine needs to negotiate with Russia now. We see arguments being banded forth that it's in major press outlets that, it'll be impossible for Ukraine to regain the occupied territories. They need to come to some kind of agreement now before things spiral out of control even worse, and so on. So there's a lot of pressure being placed on Ukraine from that end. And plus the allies that aren't outright pushing us to negotiate themselves have indicated a decent amount of dissatisfaction with the Ukrainian government, which of course is reciprocal. There's plenty of things Ukraine can point to. But overall, this was a diplomatic push to kind of alleviate some of the pressure, to placate the naysayers. And especially with that last point, the where Ukraine offers to replace some U.S. bases. So I think this is really telling us to the nature of the victory plan itself. For a long time, there have been typically Republicans in the United States that are rather more isolationist than other members of Congress. And they have consistently, and this point was also raised by former President Donald Trump, that Europe is somehow not pulling its weight in terms of defense, that the U.S. is shouldering basically the Europe's security burden. And to be fair, that isn't an entirely incorrect thing to say. The United States does contribute a significant portion to the NATO budget. U.S. military forces and assets are deployed all over Europe, and there are a ton of security agreements and so on. So this point is specifically addressing that concern, saying, look, to the Europeans that are not, let's say, as enthusiastic about continued American involvement, or maybe they're worried about the perceived irresponsibility or unreliability of the United States as a continuing defense partner. So Ukraine goes and says, look, I know you guys are worried about this. So we have a battle-tested military. We've won, multiple successes on the battlefield. Our military forces have grown quite experienced. We're willing after the war to take a hand, to play a role in Europe's security infrastructure, that won't necessarily involve the United States. And so that's a real good showing that this is mostly a kind of diplomatically focused document.
Yeah, we didn't get any questions on that specifically, the thing you just mentioned, but I also haven't really seen it in basically any news outlets. Is that a lot of people seem to be missing that one of the very important structural issues of this victory plan that we can look at, that's not just PR, is that it is leaning much more heavily on the idea of European security and becoming less reliant on America. Again, partially because the election. We don't know how the election will go. And also overall, Europe does need to focus on its own defense. So it is written into the idea of this victory plan that is a European security structure. Next question. What part of the victory plan can be implemented the fastest? What's most immediate? What can we do tomorrow?
Probably the kind of closest term. So I wouldn't say any of these points are something that can be done on a dime or tomorrow, or implement one for the next 5 days and hey, we're done with the war. There's nothing like that in this plan. But there are some things that can be done quicker than others. For example, the second point, which speaks to the continuing defense of Ukrainian territory against the Russian invaders, includes the stipulation that long-range restrictions need to be lifted from Ukraine's use of Western donated cruise missiles. And this is something that can be done like that by leaders. There's no effort involved. There's no money involved. The only thing that's really necessary is political will. But assuming that will exists, this is a step that can be easily solved with a phone call. And is probably the easiest thing is to simply provide Ukraine with the arms it needs. And like Anthony, like you said, this is a lot, like everything that is in this victory plan has been said by Ukraine before. There's no sudden new ask aside from, I suppose, the offer to use Ukrainian troops for European security. But otherwise, the strengthening of defense point is everything the Ukraine has been saying: lift the long range weapons restrictions, supply Ukraine promptly with everything they need, not drip feed it, and provide us the things that we really do need when we ask for it. Like I said, most of this is really down to a political consideration and not something that is overly physically time consuming or laborious to accomplish.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a reiteration of points that have been saying, give permission to use long range weapons. That can be done with a phone call. Question 3. What are the secret addendums? You kind of went over that, but can you go into any more detail?
Yeah. So the secret addendums, of which there are 3, we know that they exist. A member of Zelensky's administration talked about them in general terms. And he claimed that they are mostly to do, the reason they're classified is they're mostly to do with specific weapon systems and specific numbers of things that Ukraine is asking for, which of course they don't want to make public and tell Russia, these are the exact weapon systems we want. Wouldn't really make a lot of sense. So that's classified. But then again, there are 3 of them. And one presumes that a list of, war material that we're requesting doesn't take all 3. So what the other 2 could be, it's hard to say. We can probably make an educated guess and say that there are other diplomatically focused points, just like the rest of them. Why they're secret, who knows? It's a war.
Next question. How is it being received in Western governments? What has been the response so far?
Well, fortunately for Zelensky, it has not been a real vote getter or attention getter in the West and in partner nations. There's been a bit of pushback, especially from Central Europe. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has criticized parts of the plan. The Hungarian President Viktor Orban has straight up said that the plan is a surefire way to destroy Europe or something hyperbolic like this. The United States has said that they're not on board with all aspects of the victory plan, but they support Ukraine regardless, etc. So it's not been a resounding success. At the same time, it is what a lot of partner nations requested. It is a step-by-step plan of how to achieve victory. It's kind of, the plan can kind of be thought of Ukraine throwing the diplomatic ball into the West's court and saying, here guys, here's our plan. Here's our game plan. You got to act it out. Like we have to work together on this to actually implement and actually win. And if you refuse to do so, that's, I guess that's for a later question.
They have to explain, they have to explain the reason for saying no. They have to give a reason for, the specific things that they don't want to do. And that has always been an issue with, especially Germany, where this kind of rhetorical support has been there. The financial support has been there. Like the support has been there, but has always it's always been a slow dragging process of first they say no, then they say maybe, then they say yes. And with this, it's basically telling them, here's our list of things that we want. Say yes or say no. And if you do that, give a reason for saying yes or no. It is, like you said, the ball is in your court. But then, of course, Hungary is the one that really stands out here. Hungary has really been the infant terrible of Europe. They have been at every single step of the way. Hungary or the government of Viktor Orban specifically in Hungary has really been trying to drag its feet on every little issue. They have called for an end to EU aid and have attempted to carry out an end to European Union aid to Ukraine until the question of the American elections is settled, which can take time. And in that time means deaths. That's always what it means. So Hungary is stalling. They want to have direct negotiations between the European Union and Russia, which is just traitorous. And so they've definitely been the worst, but in an expected way. I think the cool reception from countries that are friendlier to Ukraine has been the bigger problem. This is what you wanted. Why can't you just accept it?
This kind of touches on the fifth question here, which is, what's the purpose of a plan that doesn't involve negotiations with Russia? And to be honest, the purpose of a plan that doesn't involve negotiations with Russia is simply to be in the best possible position for negotiations going forward. And on top of that, one presumes that there will be a Russia to negotiate with. One of the recurring cries from Ukrainians over the course of at least the past 3 years, and some people calling it for longer, is the dissolution of the Russian Federation as a state, with Ukrainians, obviously by my side, quite rightly, arguing that the Russia's unprovoked aggression against its neighbors, constant unprovoked aggression against its neighbors, culminating in a very clear, very obviously stated genocidal war of extermination against Ukrainians, that Russia should not exist, that Ukraine cannot be safe as long as there is a single political entity called Russia. And in which case, there wouldn't really be a need to negotiate with a country that no longer exists. And beyond all that, more pragmatically, if people aren't on board with that special line of reasoning, more pragmatically, Russia will only ever negotiate when it is obviously losing and has been losing for a long time. And it needs just something to start saving face, to start giving in. Russia will not negotiate if it perceives its own position to be anything less than a complete loss. So pretty much that's the only time Russia will negotiate. And the way to ensure that Russia experiences this complete loss, that that the Kremlin really feels as if, oh no, we're going to lose everything, is for partner nations to fulfill the points of the plan. In that case, with that support and Ukraine's continued success on the battlefield, Russia, once it has been pushed out of the occupied territories, will not have a leg to stand on. They haven't even been able to regain control of the portions of Russian territory that Ukraine has occupied. So it's all about building the pressure on Russia to ensure they have as weak a negotiating position as they want, because Russia will treat anything else, anything more than that, as surrender talks for Ukraine, even if it's still arguable or in the air or Russia's clearly on the downtrend, until they really feel that the wolf's teeth's around their neck. They're not going to retreat or surrender or even agree to have talks, actual peace talks. So as a result, the plan doesn't really bother with saying that. It just says, well, if we implement this, then we will be in the best possible position to force Russia to concede.
Yes, ultimately, none of Russia's demands at the start of the war were rational. They were all made up. They're all lies. And you cannot have a rational discussion with someone being fundamentally irrational. What they want is the extermination of Ukraine, and they see it as a civilizational level struggle. So there's not much you can negotiate with there. They have to be beaten. They have to have no hope of ever destroying Ukraine, and have it so clear, have it so society rending that will never happen. That is when there will be peace. And even then there will still be elements. Like I don't think that any peace treaty will be especially stable. But yeah, so peace through victory is the only way out of this. There is no half measure that does not result in yet another war shortly down the line. So the next question kind of ties into that. What is the alternative if the victory plan is not adopted?
Well, let's be frank here for a moment. The very first point of the victory plan is that Ukraine receives a invite to join NATO. That is a non-starter. NATO has been consistent over the past 14 years that it will never admit a member state with territorial disputes. It is out of the question. Obviously, it is incredibly easy for even territorial disputes that aren't currently being warred over, but are simply administrative or diplomatic kerfuffles. It's extremely easy to see how that kind of situation can start spiraling and escalating for a military alliance, which then finds itself in a war it may not have wanted to participate in. And for that reason alone, though it isn't the only reason NATO isn't going to admit Ukraine until our territory is sovereign again, but it is the biggest one, is that NATO it will not do this. As long as there's a territorial issue, Ukraine will not be admitted. You can ask, of course, why does Ukraine keep angling for NATO membership, even if it's clear to everyone, or at least mostly clear to most observers, that this isn't going to happen? Well, again, that has to do with diplomatic pressure. NATO was initially created to be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Russia, the literal successor state to the Soviet Union, is once again threatening Europe, and yet NATO stands by. So the diplomatic pressure that Ukraine is trying to put on is for NATO member states to play a more active role in this conflict. I don't think anyone in Bankova realistically expects to receive an invite from NATO while we are in the middle of a war. And if they do, I would advise them to stop harboring that belief, because it's never going to happen. But we can keep harping on how hypocritical it is that the anti-Soviet alliance, now that we are being menaced by a country that is the USSR, but just 30 years later, without a bunch of colonies, and NATO stands by, it's a very galling thing as a Ukrainian to see. But beyond that point, like, again, so that point's not going to get adopted. The last point is a post-war thing anyway. So really, there is no quote unquote alternative to the victory plan, because what you have left with is strengthening the defense, strengthening the economy, and a non-nuclear deterrent. Strengthening defense, again, that's a political decision. Strengthening the economy, also pretty much just a political decision and an influx of cash into the government budget. And the non-nuclear deterrent is a bit of diplomatic trickery, I would say. And that has everything to do with a comment that Zelensky made the other day, where he said the gist of Zelensky's point was that either we are given an invite to NATO or Ukraine might explore the option of developing nuclear weapons. And the reason I say that point is a non-nuclear deterrent is kind of diplomatic trickery, really is kind of the same as the third point of strengthening Ukraine's defense, in that it's there to serve as a reminder that if Ukraine is really, really excluded from the club of democracy, from NATO, from the European Union, etc., and we are left with the level of support we currently have now, which is just survivable and nothing that will actually lead to victory, then Ukraine is going to have to search for other options. We won't have a choice if the military alliance won't defend us, if partner nations are refusing to supply us with all the arms we ask, if they're supplying those arms with tons of restrictions, if these arms are being supplied on a political versus a military needs basis, then Ukraine will have no other choice but to explore other options for deterring Russian aggression. And we've quite frankly seen in the past 30 or so years since the collapse of the Soviet Union that nuclear weapons do give a nation state a great deal of latitude to operate that is not given to non-nuclear powers. Nuclear armed nation states, or even nation states that are presumed but not confirmed to have nuclear weapons, are still given a very wide playing field and a lot of excuses and a lot of ignorance of their acts, like Russia, that Ukraine and other non-nuclear powers can only dream of having. Zelensky added that we don't want nuclear weapons. We want to join NATO. Disarmament used to be at least a very popular thing in Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons voluntarily was seen as kind of a something to be proud of. One of the few things to be proud of as a Ukrainian was that we are a very peaceful people. And we have no interest in horrible weapons, especially not weapons of mass destruction like nukes. But the world is the way it is. And we are currently under this aggressive threat. We're currently under genocidal invasion. So eventually, if something doesn't give in terms of our Western partners cooperating with us, then the Ukrainian government will have to take other decisions.
Yeah, that answers our last question, because the The next question was kind of the answer to this one. Zelensky also made statements about either NATO or nuclear weapons. What are the chances of Ukraine going nuclear? Yeah, like what you said. If the choice is between nuclear weapons or the extermination of the Ukrainians as a people, you go with the nuclear weapons. And
it's not that Ukraine. Yeah. It's not that Ukraine is. This wouldn't be developing things from scratch. A great deal of the Soviet scientists and engineers that designed Soviet nuclear weapons are Ukrainian and live in Ukraine right now. Mm-hmm. And while
specifically the city of Dnipro was
Dnipro was
ICBM city.
Exactly. And there is still a very, very heavy base of talented engineers and scientists there that I'm sure are up to the task if given the appropriate resources of recreating nuclear weapons. They might not be as advanced as those fielded by powers such as the United States. But as North Korea showed, nuclear weapons mounted on rockets made in 1950s are still nukes. Those things are still nukes, even though they might be approaching 70 years old. It's as Russian dictator Vladimir Putin commenting on this issue said recently, it's not difficult to make nukes, but it's not simple either.
Right. So that closes off our first half, though I will make one more note regarding the whole NATO not accepting people with territorial disputes. That is what they say their policy is. But to answer that, I'll point out West Germany. When West Germany entered NATO, not only was there the question of disunity between Western and Eastern Germany, but technically West Germany still claimed land in Poland. The issue of like Prussia and all that question was not settled until decades later. So they absolutely still had territorial disputes when West Germany joined NATO.
Well,
so
I'll say, in my view, NATO after 1991 is a radically different organization,
of course,
to NATO pre-1991. And the actions that the alliance took during the Cold War is not really comparable to the actions it has taken since. For a long time, the single biggest critique of NATO was that what do you do when you have a military alliance and no enemies? And a lot of Europeans and Americans didn't see the point of maintaining NATO, maintaining European defense and security, because at that time in the 2000s, there didn't seem to be a real reason to. Russia was not being overly hostile to Western nations. They were instead trying to open up economically to them and to cooperate. And this cooperation went both ways. The West was more than happy to work with what it saw as a quote unquote liberalizing Russia. Unfortunately, that's not how history turned out. And NATO does have, or you would think that NATO policymakers would see that they have a new purpose. But as we've seen, a lot of NATO member states are still in this post-Cold War mindset where NATO is a little bit worthless and all we need to really do is just talk to the Russians and get them to calm down. Omitting, of course, that those talks would be over Ukrainians' dead bodies.
Correct. So entering now our second half. So there is news coming out this week, and this information has come from multiple different intelligence sources, from Ukraine, from South Korea, from several others. The United States has said similar things, that North Korean soldiers have entered the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, on the side of Russia. There is still a lot of ambiguity of what that means so far, where they are. Are they doing anything? What are they supposed to do? But that will be what our questions are about now, is North Korea as Ukraine's new direct enemy. So first question here. Do we know if North Korean soldiers have been deployed to Ukraine? Do we have an answer to that?
They have not been deployed to Ukraine yet. They are, well, at least, again, this is from our best intel, the best public intelligence that we have currently. is that North Korean troops have not yet set foot on Ukrainian soil, but they are currently on the borders. They are in Kursk, presumably within combat range of Ukrainian troops. They have so far been in Russia. Now, numerous Ukrainian intelligence sources have noted that they will very soon be deployed to battlefronts in Ukraine proper. But as of this recording and as of my best knowledge, it hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like it's all like everything that we're about to say go from here on out is going to be very ambiguous. We just don't know a lot of things. So that will be our kind of asterisk on any answer that we give now. So here, what is the benefit of using North Korean soldiers compared to others, especially regarding mobilization, that kind of thing?
Honestly, this and the third question, which is how does the use of foreign soldiers affect Russian mobilization? These are kind of the same question. I'll explain why. The reason that Russia is at all using foreign troops, not just mercenaries, not just desperate idiots that it scammed or tricked into going to Russia and then shoved onto the front lines, but an actual other country's military forces, is because Putin is trying to avoid scaring the populace. Ukrainians like to talk of Russians of having a kind of serf mentality. That is, they are very weak to authoritarian rulers and are not, and typically don't resist authoritarian rule and tyranny all that well. They seem to, in fact, welcome it and celebrate it at times. However, there is still a caveat here in that the Putin regime, while it has very massively tightened down on whatever few freedoms Russia offered its citizens up until the full-scale war, Putin's legitimacy is based in this kind of myth that he is the protector of Russia, that he is a bringer of stability. And mobilization has already committed a very strong blow against this myth, simply because a massive portion of the workforce, of the male workforce specifically, has been sent to die in Ukraine. There are currently, there's not enough labor force to fill in the massive shortages the Russian economy is currently facing in their labor market. And Russia, and calling even more men presents not the picture of, we are a victorious empire punishing our colony for daring to disobey us. But, oh no, we did a stupid thing and now we're losing and everything's horrible and it's awful. And we need to kill even more of your people, even more of our sons and daughters to make sure that this isn't a complete wash. So Putin really needs to sell that he's still a guarantor of stability. And in order to do that, he needs to avoid mass mobilization of the Russian populace, basically. And I'm not talking about the ethnic minorities, but specifically the ethnically Russian populace that lives primarily in European Russia, where most of their kind of advanced economic infrastructure is located. If Russia does start doing that, it is pretty much tantamount to Putin admitting to the Russian people that he has mismanaged the war and he has gotten a lot of them killed for no reason. As our listeners can imagine, that is not something a dictator ever wants to admit. So they will use every single trick they can come up with to avoid that kind of scenario. And this latest trick, after the mercenary portion kind of failed, is now directly asking another country to involve itself in this invasion.
And one factor that's very important here is cost. The price of every individual Russian soldier right now goes up and up and up with every passing month. A mercenary can be expensive. The signing bonuses for Russian soldiers increases all the time. This is based on region. It's not like a national price, but we see a lot of recent stories of various regional governors of Russia increasing signing bonuses to what in Russia would be a small fortune. Like if you're getting $30,000 in some region in rural Russia, that will take you a long way. So the cost of an individual soldier keeps going up and is going up kind of exponentially. They cannot maintain this trajectory indefinitely. And the way around that is mobilization, forcing people into the army, but they've been trying their hardest to do that as little as possible for the reasons you've been saying. People don't want to hear that I have to go to the army now. And when they did have these mobilizations, it did lead to unrest in places, especially like Dagestan. Dagestan had mass protests during mobilization. So there's no good options here. And so bringing in a foreign military, the North Koreans, at this point is probably cheaper on like a per unit basis than any given soldier.
So then again, we don't actually know how Russia is compensating North Korea for the use of their military. In previous kind of interactions between the Russian Federation and North Korea, the Russians would receive, I believe it was just direct dollars from the North Koreans for things like logging operations in Siberia and technology transfers. Whether that's still the case, I mean, we do know that Russia is significantly cash poor at the moment. Their economy has been propped up mostly by printing the ruble and playing with the exchange rates. But that has massively devalued it vis-a-vis the US dollar. And as a result, and not to mention all of the Russian assets that are dollar denominated and connected to US financial institutions, which have now been placed under sanction or frozen. So maybe they're really paying, or it's hard to say without knowing exactly how Russia is compensating North Korea. But likely it's going to be something significant for Russia, as the North Korean dictator is not someone who does things out of the kindness of his heart.
Yeah. And of course, North Korea itself is a cash poor country, under heavy sanction. A lot of the cash they do have is taken through, essentially organized crime, like illicit means that is indistinguishable from non-state organized crime. So these are two economies that are restricted. And so it'll probably come down to some kind of political deal, more so than just money. I would have to assume. The next question here that we got is, again, a very shady one, but are the North Korean soldiers deserting en masse while fighting in Ukraine? So for that, en masse, we can't say for sure because we don't know how much or if they are fighting. But we do have a report from the Ukrainian outlet, Sospilna, the public media outlet in Ukraine, has been reported in some other outlets such as Newsweek, claiming that some North Korean soldiers have deserted while they are deployed along the Ukrainian border. So if they're fighting in Kursk. So this report said that, let me look it up, 18 North Korean soldiers are believed to have deserted. I would have to imagine that if any actual fighting goes on, this number will go up, just because the North Korean army, North Korea is not a very cozy place to live, even if you do have a special status like a soldier would have. And I'd assume that any soldiers deployed this far overseas into something as sensitive would have to be tested in some way for their loyalty. But even Russia, a country that is not especially wealthy. And in Kursk Oblast, which is a region of Russia that is not especially wealthy compared to other parts of the country, it's still better than living in North Korea. So I'd assume that a lot of people may be seeing life outside the country for the first time and realizing, what am I even doing here?
I mean, that has to be a question a lot of the North Korean soldiers are asking. And we also have to remember that there's no, I don't know, to put it as, I don't mean this poetically, I mean this as literally as possible. There's no one free in North Korea. All of the soldiers, especially kind of the line troopers of the type that they're going to be deploying in Ukraine, are not going to be especially privileged members of society that have the freedom of choice in their occupation. They might have been conscripted, they might have been mobilized, they might have been forcibly recruited. Their morale and their desire to fight and die on foreign soil for a cause, I guarantee you, they will not understand nor care about, is not especially conducive to morale. So at the same time, North Korea is kind of known for enforcing discipline rather harshly internally. It's known for punishing not just a political prisoner, but their entire family, to really drive the point home that the Kim dynasty does not like anyone doing anything that they didn't approve of, pretty much. And you end up with a very volatile situation. It's a big question of exactly how useful a bunch of, starving, essentially slave soldiers are going to be for Russia.
Okay, this next one is a pivot towards the broader view of things. How important are North Korean supplies to the Russian war effort? So moving beyond just the soldiers, like, what is the role of North Korea in the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
The materiel that North Korea supplies to Russia is far more important than the actual warm bodies, at least in my view.
And I'll take a pause because I haven't said this yet. The number of North Korean soldiers reported to be involved in this is roughly 10,000. So
it's not especially large.
It's not huge in the context of the war.
And as a result, the shells that they ship, so both Ukraine and Russia face kind of the same problem in regards to shells. That is, the artillery pieces that are used are largely Soviet era, and largely speaking, the factories and the backbones of the Soviet arms industry that would produce these shells and the quantities necessary for a superpower no longer exist and haven't existed for 36 years. Of course, Russia does still have factories producing these shells, and even Ukraine does, but these are very, very small operations compared to the sheer scale of use of shells in a full-scale industrial war, as well as the fact that, it's been 30 years and a lot of these things go bad and rust, and you can't rely on stuff in storage. Russia obviously has more stuff in storage and more small factories, but a large part of, especially the first year and a half of this war, was these two countries seeking out any other source of shells. For Russia, that source has been North Korea, which has its own very large stockpiles of old Soviet shells, exactly the kinds that the Russians need, because they gave the North Koreans those shells 30 or 40 or 50 years ago.
They were Soviet in the first place.
Exactly. Ukraine has scrimped and borrowed and begged and bought and gotten a few more factories up and running, and that's been enough to alleviate the so-called shell hunger. But the kind of industrial prowess, you could call that, of the North Koreans right now is what is valuable for Russia. I really don't think the grunts are going to do anything, but the continued deliveries of shells and artillery barrels and other assorted military material that North Korea has in large stockpiles has been pretty key to Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important thing about this war, not just related to North Korea, but overall, is that, like you said, the industrial production does not match the industrial war. No country since the Cold War has been planning for mass artillery bombardments as a form of warfare in decades. America hasn't done that type of war since the Korean War. But there are still lots of these stockpiles that are still sitting around. And with North Korea, their whole strategy for national existence for much of this time is, if you mess with us, we have the number of artillery shells to turn Seoul into a pile of rubble within the opening hours of a war. They have the numbers. Though what they have found is that a lot of the North Korean shells are not exactly high quality. There have been issues of them exploding in the barrel that have caused problems. I don't think that North Korean artillerymen are especially on top of their maintenance schedules. Russians aren't either, but I assume North Koreans are even more of a sorry state. But when you have enough of them, quantity, as always, has a quality all of its own. So what other countries might also do the same as North Korea? Meaning, is anyone going to send soldiers to Ukraine?
Well, hopefully not. It's, of course, impossible to say what the future holds. But
I think the question was more on the Ukrainian side. But we can
on the Ukrainian side,
yes.
Well, on the Russian side, I was going to say even Belarus, which is part of the quote unquote union state with Russia. They're technically one government or some idiocy like that. Even Belarus has not ever committed any of its troops in direct conflict with Ukraine, and has in fact shot down Russian drones flying over Belarusian territory, which NATO powers have not done in similar situations. That is, NATO powers have not shut down Russian drones flying over their territory, while Russia's purported close ally and partner, Belarus, has done. But no, there's no sign that the Iranians have any desire to send troops, or that Russia has anything to offer them to send those troops. Belarus if it hasn't done it, it's not going to do it now. And the Chinese are definitely not going to do it. So it's pretty much just the North Koreans. For the Ukrainian side, again, it's been 3 years. Not a single partner nation has sent military forces to Ukraine. In NATO, out of NATO, doesn't matter. No one has done that. No one is going to do that. No one has any plans to do that. It is basically out of the question. It is considered quite rude to bring it up to diplomats, because there is the unspoken kind of quote unquote agreement in Europe that Ukraine's war is Ukraine's war, and Europe is there to help prop us up and pick up the pieces afterwards. That's what Europe is doing, and everything else is on us Ukrainians, which it's difficult to fault them. It is, after all, Ukrainian territory that is getting invaded. At the same time, when you see things like China assisting Russia in sanctions evasion, Iran sending not just drones, but the technical ability to construct drones, and that technology to Russia, North Korea supplying both shells and men, and Ukraine gets a drip feed of arms that are typically restricted from achieving their primary purposes. So no one is going to fight on the Ukrainian side. If they were, I believe we would have seen something by now. Even statements made by French President Emmanuel Macron, who I believe last year or earlier this year was saying that he had plans to send French troops to safeguard key places like Odessa and so on. That never materialized either. A lot of this has to do with with domestic political pressures. A lot of these countries have a domestic opposition that is either neutral on the question of Ukraine or directly anti-Ukraine. Thinking of Germany, of France, and as a result, the leadership cannot be seen to favor Ukraine too much domestically, or else the opposition parties will gain influence. And a lot of times, these opposition parties are far-right parties. with very radical ideas of how these countries should be governed.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there are any real candidates for either side of this, no. Next question. What has been the South Korean response? This is very important here as far as the Korean Peninsula. So how has South Korea responded to this?
So I'll mention the global response because, to be honest, the South Korean response, while stronger, has not been that much stronger to the global response to the deployment of a third party's literal troops in Ukraine, or at least in combat against Ukrainian soldiers, has been a big shrug. No one cares. No one seems to treat this with any sort of urgency or importance. It's just another development in this unfortunate conflict. And South Korea obviously takes it a little more seriously, but the only thing their government has committed to is an investigation of the deployment of these troops. I don't know what they're investigating or how or what they hope to achieve with this investigation. But they claim that they are watching the North Koreans and are ready to help Ukraine. Though again, it's all been very vague and diplomatic. And North Korea and South Korea has not committed itself to any kind of course of action here. So maybe they will increase military aid to Ukraine. Again, troops are out of the question. But maybe they will just sit on the sidelines. Again, the South Korea is a big, how do I say this? South Korea is a major Asian partner for the United States and relies on the U.S. military quite heavily for its defense, as well as, of course, the domestic military, which is very entwined with the U.S. military industrial complex. And as a result, the South Korean government is quite limited in how they can act militarily outside of the United States' purview, so to say.
Yes, I will say for South Korea, though, that just as North Korea has been a big supplier for Russian artillery shells, the South Koreans have also been a supplier for Ukrainian artillery shells. This has not been like a consistent delivery kind of thing, but there have been some very, very large deliveries, and these deliveries have happened at very key and important moments. Because just as North Korea has readied itself for a large-scale conventional war against South Korea has done the same thing, has readied itself for a large-scale conventional war against North Korea. So of the short list of countries in the world that has the amount of material that is necessary, South Korea is among them, and they have helped out for that reason. So they do have they've been talking about, commentators, not like an official response, have been talking about more aid that has been going on, which is definitely possible and would not be a huge rupture in current South Korean policy. So it wouldn't be that big of a deal on that end, I don't believe. So we just had one more question that we already asked about the potential of foreign intervention in Ukraine, and we kind of already covered that already. So I'll just be shutting out this half of the episode as well by just saying that this is a very new development. So if there's any international response, we can wait a while. We don't know what those North Korean soldiers are really doing. If North Korea commits more, there might have to be more of an international response. This is still a very new and developing story. So, and of course, like we said at the start, very shrouded in question marks. So that closes off our Q&A session for this week. You can join us again in 2 weeks. So there will be another announcement for what the topic will be and a call for questions such as the ones that you just heard. So thank you all very much for listening in, both live and our recording. Thank you all for the questions that you sent us. And thank you all for supporting the new Voice of Ukraine. Supporting independent journalism within Ukraine is more as important as it ever was. There is a lot of political question marks over Ukraine's head right now, as we've alluded to, talking about the peace plan and elections and all that. As always, the advertising market is quite restrictive for Ukrainian businesses, so your support through Patreon is very important and is what keeps us going. So thank you all very, very much for your support to the New Voice of Ukraine. And until our next Q&A session, we have our newsletter going up today as well. We have been posting infographics pretty much every day, and we are generally expanding our offerings through our Patreon. So if you are interested in more material through New Voice of Ukraine as a subscriber, it's definitely coming, and we are looking for more and more ways to expand. So until our next episode, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.